At 72, Eleanor Price believed her life had finally grown quiet. She had spent decades as an emergency room nurse, standing at the edge of life and death, and now wanted nothing more than peace in the snowy forests of Michigan. But one night, during a brutal storm, something knocked on her door. And it wasn't human. The choice she made in that moment broke every rule of nature and changed her life forever. The blizzard had been chewing at the pines for hours, packing snow into every seam of Eleanor Price's little cabin outside Marquette. Inside, the air held a steady warmth from the propane heater, but the windows still rattled like thin bones. At 72, she moved slower now, yet her ears stayed sharp, trained by decades of alarms, footsteps, and sudden bad news. Eleanor had been a retired ER nurse for 6 years, long enough to forget the smell of antiseptic, but not the rhythm of crisis. She could sleep through thunder, but not through anything that sounded deliberate. The storm had its own language: wind, groan, scrape, none of it personal. Tonight, she told herself, was just weather doing what weather does. She set her tea down, listened, and tried to read the storm the way she used to read monitors. The power had flickered twice, then held. Her phone showed one bar that came and went like a shy animal. On the table sat an old handheld radio, her late husband's, the kind that could still reach the county line when everything else failed. A new sound threaded through the house, faint at first, like ice tapping wood. Eleanor paused with her hand on the chair back. Tap, tap. Not the window, not the roof. It came from the front door, low and measured, as if someone was knocking with a knuckle that didn't quite know how to be human. Her pulse lifted, slow but insistent. Nobody drove that road in a whiteout. The nearest neighbor was miles of timber and drifted ditches away. She crossed the living room and shut off the lamp, letting the cabin fall into dark, then reached the curtain with 2 fingers and peeled it back a sliver. The porch light was a weak halo in the snow. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing but blowing white. Then a shape stepped into the glow. A wild cat. Big shoulders, tufted ears, a coat the color of dead leaves under snow. It stood on her porch as if it belonged there, head lifted, eyes bright and steady in a way that made Eleanor's throat tighten. The cat wasn't alone. At its feet lay a smaller shape, a tight bundle pressed into the boards, barely moving. Eleanor's nurse brain tried to label it: frostbite, shock, hypothermia, while another part of her, older and quieter, simply felt the wrongness of it. Wild things did not bring their suffering to a doorstep. Eleanor's palm pressed to the glass. The cat's gaze shifted, not to the window, but to her. Direct, anchored, almost accusatory. It didn't hiss. It didn't bolt. It held its ground against the wind like a mother who had already spent every other option. Eleanor had seen that look before, on human faces in triage, the silent plea that said, "Please, not like this." She unlatched the door without opening it, just enough to let cold bite her knuckles. Snow rushed in, sharp as salt. The wildcat backed up half a step, body low, but it didn't leave. The bundle on the porch trembled, and a thin sound slipped out, small, wet, not quite a cry, more like breath trying to become one. Eleanor's mind split cleanly down the middle. One side recited rules: keep distance, don't habituate, don't invite danger into your home. The other side remembered a child's blue lips, remembered hands that moved on instinct before fear could vote. She reached for her boots, then stopped, because the cat's eyes never blinked. A gust slammed the porch rail, and the wildcat flinched, then steadied again, as if choosing to stay was an act of will. Eleanor saw the curve of its ribs beneath the fur, the thinness winter carved into predators when prey ran scarce. She also saw something darker on the porch boards near the bundle, an ugly stain half hidden by snow. She didn't swing the door wide. She didn't step out like a hero. Instead, she whispered into the gap, a useless promise carried into the storm. "Okay, I see you." The words were for herself as much as for the animal. Her voice came out rough, the way it used to after a night shift when every room had needed her at once. She backed away from the door and grabbed the old radio from the table, fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. The cabin felt suddenly too small, like a waiting room with no exits. Eleanor turned the dial until static became a thin thread of sound. "County," she said, steadying her breath. "This is Eleanor Price. I need Deputy Delaney. Now." Outside, the wild cat remained on the porch, hunched against the storm, guarding the bundle with a patience that didn't belong to fear. Eleanor stood in the dim kitchen light, radio hiss in her hand, and understood, with a clarity that scared her, that whatever happened next would not end at her doorstep. It would reach into the rest of her life and rearrange it. Morning came muted and pale, the way it did up in Michigan when winter refused to loosen its grip. The storm still owned the woods, but the worst of it had eased into a steady, relentless fall. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with her hands around a warm mug, listening to the quiet between gusts like it might explain the night. She had lived alone for years, not out of bitterness, but out of a kind of careful peace. After the ER, after the endless sirens and fluorescent nights, she'd wanted a life where the loudest thing was wind through pine needles. Her cabin was small, neat, and familiar. Everything in reach, everything with a purpose, nothing that asked too much of her heart. The retirement papers had felt like relief and grief at the same time. In the hospital, Eleanor had been useful, in the purest way. A steady pair of hands when someone else was falling apart. At home, usefulness looked different. It was chopping kindling before her back complained, keeping her driveway passable, checking on the weather radio, and calling her son once a week so he wouldn't worry. She kept a photo of her husband by the window, the glass slightly fogged from the heater. Walter had loved gadgets and old frequencies, loved the idea that you could still reach someone through static if you were patient enough. When he died, his radio stayed on the shelf like a quiet sentinel. Some nights Eleanor caught herself glancing at it, as if it might answer back. Deputy Mark Delaney had come by a few times since Walter's funeral, always in the same respectful way. Knocking, waiting, asking if she needed anything without making her feel helpless. He was younger than her son, but his face carried the same tired softness Eleanor recognized in people who spent their days solving other folks' problems. "You holding up, Mrs. Price?" he'd ask, and she'd say, "I'm here, aren't I?" On the night before the blizzard, Mark had warned her about the storm and about something else. They'd stood on her porch under a clean, cold sky, his breath hanging between them. "We found signs of illegal traps back in the state land," he'd said. "If you see anything that looks off, wire, bait, a metal bite mark, don't touch it. Call me." Eleanor had nodded, but her mind had drifted, not to traps, but to the thin shape she'd seen at the tree line a week earlier. Just a flash of tawny fur and a pair of eyes that didn't belong to any house cat. She hadn't mentioned it. People heard "wild cat" and thought she was lonely enough to invent company. Still, she'd seen hunger up close. Not the romantic kind, not the storybook kind, the real kind that hollows cheeks and makes the body spend itself. In the ER, hunger wore many disguises. A proud man with the flu, a grandmother skipping meals so her grandkids could eat, a teenager pretending they just forgot lunch. Hunger had a smell, a look, a quiet shame. One evening, after a hard freeze, Eleanor stepped outside with a small bowl of leftover chicken. Not a feast. Not a habit. Just a little something placed far from her steps, near the edge of the clearing, where the woods began. She told herself she was preventing waste, nothing more. She kept her porch light off and her distance intact. The next morning, the bowl was empty, and small tracks stitched the snow like a quick signature. Eleanor studied them the way she used to study bruises, reading direction, speed, intention. The tracks weren't clumsy like raccoons. They were clean, purposeful, feline. Her chest tightened with a strange mix of satisfaction and worry she couldn't name. After that, she made rules, because rules were how she kept herself safe. She would never leave food every day. She would never step closer than the porch steps. She would never speak to it like it understood. She would never name it. She wasn't building trust, she told herself. She was offering a thin mercy to winter and letting the wild stay wild. And then, on a morning when the snow lay smooth as paper, she noticed a second set of prints. Smaller, lighter, close beside the first, as if following a path already learned. Eleanor stood on her porch with her robe pulled tight and felt something in her soften. A mother, she thought. A mother teaching a child how to survive in a place that didn't care. The emotional math shifted after that. Feeding one animal was one thing. Feeding a mother with a young was another kind of weight. Eleanor remembered Mark's warning, remembered the traps. She imagined a small body caught, panicking, twisting until the panic turned into injury. The thought sat in her stomach like cold metal, and she didn't know whether to stop or to keep watching. When the blizzard finally arrived, it arrived like a door slamming shut. Eleanor stayed inside, tending the heater, rationing batteries, keeping her phone charged when the power blinked. Every few hours she'd stand at the window and search the whiteout for movement, then scold herself for looking. It was the wilderness, she reminded herself. It was not her ward. Yet as the wind rose and the cabin creaked, she couldn't shake the memory of those two sets of tracks. She found herself whispering a habit from her nursing days, a small prayer without religion. "Stay warm," she said into the storm, feeling foolish. "Find shelter. Just make it through." By the time dawn thinned the darkness, Eleanor's calm had frayed around the edges. She sat at her table and listened to the radio hiss, the same way she used to listen for a change in a patient's breathing. Outside, the woods were buried and silent. And somewhere beyond the porch, in all that white, a choice she'd made with a scrap of chicken had started to move toward her. Quietly, inevitably. Like footsteps she hadn't heard yet. The days after the storm blurred into one another, each morning pale and hushed, as if the world were holding its breath. Eleanor rose early, the habit of decades refusing to loosen, and stood at the window with her hands wrapped around coffee gone lukewarm. The clearing looked untouched, smooth as linen, and for the first time since winter set in, there were no tracks to read. She told herself it meant nothing. Snow erased stories all the time, but her eyes kept returning to the same places, the bowl she hadn't set out during the storm, the edge of the trees where the tawny shape usually appeared at dusk. Absence, she knew, could speak louder than panic if you listened long enough. On the third morning, Eleanor pulled on her boots and stepped onto the porch, testing each board like she was testing ice. The cold cut through her coat, sharp and clean. She walked only as far as the steps, leaning on the railing to study the ground. Still nothing. No long stride, no quick darting prints, no small companion set. She remembered the way the wild cat had once paused at the tree line, ears turning toward her cabin as if weighing a risk. That pause replayed in her mind now, slow and deliberate. In the ER, pauses were dangerous. They meant a body deciding whether to keep going. Eleanor pressed her lips together and breathed, Her radio crackled to life on the counter behind her, a thin thread of sound cutting the quiet. Eleanor stepped back inside and lifted it, recognizing Deputy Delaney's voice under the static. He was checking on residents after the storm, his tone brisk but careful. "You doing okay out there, Mrs. Price?" "I'm fine," she said, because that was what people said when they didn't want to complicate things. She almost mentioned the missing tracks, then didn't. Mark had already warned her. She didn't want to sound like someone chasing ghosts through snow. That afternoon, Eleanor noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Near the tree line, half buried by drifted snow, was a dark smear that hadn't been there before. She didn't step closer. She didn't need to. She had seen enough blood to recognize it, even diluted by ice and time. The memory of Mark's words came back uninvited. Illegal traps, wire jaws, bait hidden where curiosity and hunger met. Eleanor's hands curled into fists at her sides. She felt the old anger rise, the one that came when harm was careless and preventable. It was an emotion she had learned to manage, not silence. That night, sleep came in pieces. Wind worried the eaves, and every sound threaded itself into her dreams. She woke before dawn to a noise that didn't belong to weather. Not loud, not frantic. Just a short, broken sound carried on the cold air, as if someone, or something, had tried to call and stopped. Eleanor sat up, heart steady but heavy, listening until the sound faded. She did not open the door. She did not turn on the light. She told herself that the wilderness was full of voices, and not all of them meant disaster. Still, she lay awake until the sky thinned to gray. By morning, the silence felt wrong in a way she couldn't measure. Eleanor brewed coffee she barely tasted and stood at the window again. That was when she saw the first sign. A single erratic track near the porch, deeper than the others had been, as if the animal had stumbled or dragged a weight. Her breath caught. She followed the line with her eyes, tracing where it curved too close to the house, then veered away. There was no second set beside it. No small, careful steps. Eleanor closed her eyes and counted, the way she used to before delivering bad news. 1, 2, 3. She reached for the radio, then stopped. Calling wouldn't change what had already happened. Instead, she set a small amount of food at the edge of the clearing, farther out than usual, a quiet offering she didn't expect to see. Taken. The act steadied her hands, even as doubt pressed in. As dusk settled, Eleanor remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the tree line darken. The woods did not answer her attention. Yet somewhere between the shadows and the snow, she felt a pull she couldn't name, an approaching moment that would demand more than observation. In her bones, she sensed it wasn't finished with her yet. Deputy Mark Delaney arrived just before noon, his truck pushing through the last of the plowed drifts with a tired growl. He cut the engine and sat for a moment, scanning the tree line before stepping out. Eleanor noticed that pause. It was the same one she used to take before entering a trauma bay. One breath to prepare for whatever waited inside. They stood on the porch, with the door closed behind them, cold seeping through the boards. Mark's eyes dropped immediately to the snow near the clearing, then to the faint smear Eleanor hadn't mentioned on the radio. He crouched, careful not to disturb it, and exhaled slowly. "That's blood," he said, not accusing, just certain. Eleanor nodded. She felt no need to explain how she knew. Mark straightened, rubbing his hands together, and glanced toward the woods. "We pulled 2 illegal traps yesterday, about a mile east of here," he said. "Steel jaws, old school. Whoever set them knows this terrain." His jaw tightened. "They don't care what they catch." She felt the words land like weight. Eleanor thought of the smaller tracks beside the larger ones, the way they'd moved together. "If something got caught," she said carefully, "would it drag itself away?" Mark met her eyes. if it could, and if there was something it needed to get back to. They stood in silence, the wind threading through them. Eleanor felt the familiar urge to act rise in her chest, the reflex honed by years of alarms. In the ER, waiting could kill. Out here, waiting felt like betrayal. "What should I do?" she asked, hating how small the question sounded. Mark chose his words. "Don't approach, don't follow tracks, and please, don't feed anymore." He held up a hand when she stiffened. "I know your heart's in the right place, but feeding changes behavior. If that cat's injured, coming closer to people could get it killed." Eleanor swallowed. She wanted to argue, to explain her rules, her distance, her restraint. Instead, she thought of the erratic track near her porch, the way it had cut too close before turning away. "What if it comes here?" she asked quietly. Mark hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. "If it does," he said, "call me first. Whatever you do, don't try to handle it alone." He softened his voice. "You've done a lot of good in your life, Mrs. Price. This isn't a failure. Sometimes the kindest thing is knowing when to stop." After he left, Eleanor stood in the doorway longer than the cold allowed, watching his truck disappear. The words stayed behind, echoing in the cabin like a diagnosis with no treatment plan. Knowing when to stop had never been her strength. Knowing when stopping meant letting go was worse. She moved through the afternoon with purpose, cleaning a counter that didn't need it, stacking wood she'd already stacked. Busy hands, she told herself, kept the mind from inventing outcomes. Yet every task felt provisional, like she was marking time until something arrived. At dusk, she noticed fresh movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow that shifted, then stilled. Eleanor froze, heart lifting and sinking at once. The wild cat stood half-hidden, body angled towards the cabin, eyes bright in the dying light. It did not approach the bowl. It did not leave. They watched each other across the clearing, neither crossing the line. Eleanor lifted her hand without thinking, then let it fall. She remembered Mark's warning, the traps, the blood. She stayed where she was, a witness bound by rules she wasn't sure she could keep. Night settled in layers. The cat melted back into the woods, and the clearing went empty again. Eleanor locked her door and leaned her forehead against the wood, breathing through a pressure she recognized too well. The moment before a case turned. She sensed it clearly now. The warning had been given. The next move would not be hers to choose. The blizzard returned with a different kind of anger, less dramatic but more relentless, laying down weight instead of noise. Eleanor woke before dawn to a cabin pressed tight by cold, the heater working harder than it should. She checked the radio, the weather band repeating warnings in a calm voice that felt almost cruel in its steadiness. She stayed inside, because staying inside was the sensible thing. The road was already gone under drifts, and the trees bowed under ice. Eleanor rationed light and movement, boiling water, layering sweaters, counting hours the way she once counted IV bags. The discipline steadied her, but it didn't quiet the worry pacing in her chest. By the second day, the quiet became oppressive. Snow muffled everything, turning the world into a sealed room. Eleanor found herself listening for sounds that didn't exist. Footsteps, scrapes, breath. She scolded herself for it, reminding herself that the woods did not revolve around her vigilance. Nature did not need an audience. That night, the power flickered and went out. The heater held, but the lights surrendered. Eleanor lit a lantern and sat at the table, the circle of light making the rest of the cabin disappear. She thought of patients she'd watched through long nights, the ones who stabilized only after you stopped staring at the numbers. On the third morning, the storm eased just enough to tempt her. Eleanor pulled on her boots and cracked the door, letting a blade of cold cut across the floor. The clearing looked altered. reshaped by drifts that erased landmarks. She scanned for movement, for tracks, for anything that said life had passed through. There was nothing. No long stride, no neat feline line. The absence struck her harder than panic would have. In the ER, silence after chaos could mean the worst. She closed the door slowly and leaned against it, feeling the weight of 3 days settle into her bones. That afternoon, she heard it. A short, broken sound carried by the wind. Not close. Not far. It slipped into the cabin like a memory, and then was gone. Eleanor stood perfectly still, heart steady but heavy, cataloging the sound the way she used to catalog pain. It wasn't a warning. It was need. As dusk fell, Eleanor noticed something new near the edge of the clearing. A drag mark, shallow and uneven, half filled by fresh snow. She did not step closer. She didn't have to. The line told its own story. Movement without balance, effort without strength. Her jaw tightened until it ached. She went back inside and set the kettle on, hands shaking just enough to notice. Rules echoed in her mind. Don't approach, don't feed, don't interfere. Rules had saved lives. Rules had also failed them. Eleanor stared at the steam rising and wondered which kind she was holding now. When night came, it came early and thick. Eleanor sat by the lantern, radio in her lap, thumb resting on the call button. She imagined Deputy Delaney walking through drifts, imagined a trapped animal making choices without language. The distance between those images felt unbearable. Close to midnight, there was a sound that cut through everything else. Not wind, not ice. A deliberate scrape against wood, low and careful, like something testing a boundary. Eleanor's breath caught. She didn't move. She waited for it to repeat. It did. Once. Then again, steadier this time, closer to the floor. Eleanor stood, lantern in hand, and crossed the room with a calm she didn't feel. At the door, she paused, recognizing the moment for what it was, the point after which nothing could be put back. She rested her forehead against the wood and closed her eyes. Whatever waited on the other side had already crossed every line she'd drawn. Eleanor straightened, fingers finding the latch by memory, and understood that the storm had not brought this to her. It had only cleared the way. Eleanor opened the door only a fraction, enough for the lantern's glow to spill onto the porch and no more. Snow hissed against the light. The wild cat stood where she had imagined it. Body low, muscles tight beneath fur stiffened by ice. It did not retreat. It shifted its weight, exposing what lay between its paws. The bundle moved. A small, uneven shudder lifted it from the boards and set it down again. Eleanor's nurse's eye took over before fear could argue. Shallow breaths, a tremor that spoke of cold and pain, not panic. The smell reached her next, metallic and wrong. Blood, old and new, caught in frozen fur. She raised the lantern, careful not to blind the animal. The light revealed a hind leg bent at an angle that did not belong to any living thing meant to run. The cat's ears flattened, not in threat but in warning, and a low sound vibrated in its chest. Eleanor felt it in her ribs like a held note. "I won't," she whispered, though she didn't know what she was promising. The cat's eyes did not leave her face. Eleanor recognized the stance from 1,000 nights in triage, the one that said, "I will endure this if you do not make it worse." She had never seen it on a wild animal before. She backed away a step and reached for the radio on the hook by the door, keeping her movement slow and visible. "County," she said into the hiss, voice steady by habit. "Deputy Delaney, I need you." Static swallowed the first reply, then Mark's voice broke through, strained by distance and weather. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause, the kind that meant someone was weighing risk against time. "I'm coming," he said. "I can't drive all the way. I'll walk in from the plow stop." Eleanor closed her eyes for a beat, relief and dread tangling. The wildcat paced 2 steps, then settled again, gaze flicking to the bundle and back to Eleanor. Snow gathered along its whiskers. Eleanor shrugged into her coat and pulled on gloves, the thick leather ones she kept for splitting wood. She did not cross the threshold yet. She waited for permission she wasn't sure existed. Another sound slipped from the bundle, thinner this time, more breath than voice. Eleanor felt the old instinct surge, the one that moved hands before words. She crouched just inside the doorway and spoke softly, not to soothe, but to mark her presence. "I see you," she said. "I'm here." She set a towel on the porch, then another, building a small island of fabric between cold and skin. The cat's head dipped, then lifted. It did not lunge. It did not flee. Eleanor took that as the narrowest opening and stepped out, boots crunching, heart loud in her ears. The growl came then, low and ragged, grief edged with warning. Eleanor stopped where she was, raised one gloved hand, and waited. In the ER, waiting could be everything. She let the seconds stretch until the sound faded to a tremor and the cat's body stilled again. When she reached the bundle, she did not touch it at first. She watched the rise and fall, counted the breaths, and made a decision she knew would follow her for the rest of her life. She slid the towel under the small body and lifted, slow and deliberate, keeping it low, keeping her face open. The wild cat surged forward 1 step, then halted, a cry tearing out of it that made Eleanor's eyes burn. "I know," Eleanor said, tears blurring the lantern light. "I know." She turned back toward the door, carrying the weight of a life that trusted her without language. Inside, she placed the bundle in the carrier she'd kept for injured birds, lining it with warmth, leaving the door open. She did not close it yet. She went back to the threshold and met the cat's gaze once more. "I'll help," she said, not loud enough to be a vow, but enough to be true. Snow fell between them, steady and unremarkable, as if nothing extraordinary were happening at all. Eleanor stood with the door open, the carrier waiting, and felt the world narrow to a single choice. Whatever came after would be consequence. This moment was commitment. Deputy Delaney arrived as a shape cut from the snow, breath ragged, boots crusted white. He stopped at the edge of the porch, reading the scene the way Eleanor read faces. Quick, exact, unsentimental. The wild cat watched him with a fixed intensity, body angled between him and the open door, as if the threshold itself were something to defend. They spoke in fragments, voices kept low. Roads were still closed. The plow couldn't reach the last mile. The rehab center was hours away even in clear weather. Mark glanced at the carrier inside, then at the twisted leg, and shook his head once. "We stabilize," he said. "Then we move, slow and clean." Eleanor nodded, already counting steps. She warmed water, folded towels, lined the carrier again, hands steady in a way that surprised her. The wildcat paced, breath frosting the air, a soundless metronome. When Eleanor reached for the bundle again, the cat growled, but did not advance. The space it allowed felt like a gift loaned under terms. She wrapped the small body with practiced care, supporting the injured limb, keeping the head free. The kitten's eyes fluttered, unfocused, then closed. Eleanor felt the old ache return, the one that followed her home after bad nights, when survival hinged on minutes. She closed the carrier door, slow enough to keep trust intact. Outside, the wildcat cried, a raw, breaking sound that sliced through the snow. Eleanor stepped back to the porch, meeting its gaze, palms open. "I'm taking him where warm hands are," she said, not because the animal understood words, but because Eleanor needed the sentence to exist. The cat's ears flattened. It did not strike. They moved at dawn, Mark carried the carrier. Eleanor followed with the radio and a bag of heat packs. The walk to the plow stop felt endless, the forest close and watching. Once, Eleanor looked back and saw the wild cat standing where the porch light would have been, still as a post, eyes locked on the path. The drive was slow, treacherous. Ice pulled at the tires. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on the carrier, counting breaths the way she always had. "Stay," she murmured, not as a plea but a direction. The kitten's breathing wavered, then steadied, and she exhaled with it. At the center, lights burned bright against the gray morning. Staff took the carrier and moved with quiet efficiency. A veterinarian spoke in careful truths. Compound fracture, hypothermia, dehydration. Possible surgery. Probable recovery. Release uncertain. Eleanor felt the words land like a measured blow, survivable, but not painless. She waited in a chair that smelled faintly of disinfectant, the old familiarity rising unbidden. Mark stood nearby, hat in his hands. "You did the right thing," he said. Eleanor watched a door close and didn't answer. Right and done were not the same. She knew that better than most. Weeks passed in drives and updates. The kitten rallied, ate, gained strength, learned to stand again. But something else changed too, subtle and permanent. He did not startle at footsteps. He watched people with interest, not fear. The line Eleanor had guarded so carefully had moved, and she could not move it back. The decision came quietly, like snow. The center explained options, sanctuaries, foster programs, training. Eleanor listened, weighing consequences with a tired precision. That night, in a motel room that felt borrowed, she stared at the ceiling and thought of a mother waiting at the edge of light. When Eleanor spoke the next morning, her voice did not shake. She would apply, she would learn, she would build what was required, and keep distance where it mattered. It wasn't the ending she had imagined at the door, but it was a promise she could keep without lying to herself. On the drive home, she stopped at the plow turn and looked toward the woods. She didn't see the wild cat. She didn't expect to. The snow fell clean and ordinary. Eleanor rested her hand on the steering wheel and felt the weight of what she had accepted. Responsibility, consequence, and a hope shaped not like rescue, but like care. Spring arrived in Michigan without ceremony, the snow retreating in patches that revealed dark earth and last year's leaves. Eleanor worked through the thaw with a quiet determination, measuring distances, studying plans, learning a new vocabulary of permits and protocols. Care, she discovered, was a structure you built piece by piece, not a feeling you relied on. The enclosure rose beside the tree line, set back from the house, open to wind and weather, but bounded by rules she would not bend. Natural cover, climbing logs, a shallow stream fed by meltwater, everything designed to give space, not closeness. Eleanor followed the instructions exactly, the way she always had when the stakes were real. The young wildcat came home on a gray afternoon, carried in a crate that hummed with breath and tension. Eleanor stayed back while the specialist opened the door and stepped away. She watched from a distance as the animal paused, scented, then moved, careful, testing, into a world that was neither hospital nor forest, but something between. Days settled into a rhythm that asked little of Eleanor's voice. She fed through systems that kept her unseen. She observed from windows and trail cameras, noting patterns the way she once charted vitals. The cat learned the boundaries, learned the water, learned the rocks. It did not look for her. Eleanor counted that as success. Then one evening at dusk, the woods shifted. Eleanor saw the movement first on the edge of her vision, a familiar tawny shape emerging where the shadows thickened. The mother stood at the tree line, still as memory, ears lifted, eyes bright. Eleanor did not step forward. She did not call out. She waited. The mother moved with purpose, circling the enclosure once, then stopping where the mesh met the forest. Inside, the young cat lifted his head. He approached slowly, body low, curiosity and recognition braided together. They faced each other through the barrier, breath visible, time stretching thin and quiet. No sound passed between them. No cry, no warning. Just a long, unbroken look that seemed to hold winter, blood, snow, and a door opened a fraction. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, then ease, as if something she'd been holding had finally found a place to rest. After a while, the mother sat back on her haunches, still watching. The young cat mirrored the posture, steady on a leg that bore its scars without apology. Eleanor understood then that reunion did not require touch. Sometimes it required only knowing where the other stood. As darkness deepened, the mother rose and retreated, not vanishing, but settling into a patch of laurel with a clear line of sight. She stayed there until the moon climbed, then slipped away without sound. Eleanor exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was saving. The visits continued through the season, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always on the mother's terms. As the young cat grew, the meetings grew fewer, the pauses shorter. Eleanor expected the letting go. She welcomed it, even as it carried a quiet ache. A year later, a trail camera caught the mother again at the forest edge, pausing near the enclosure before moving on. Eleanor studied the image and smiled. Not with pride, but with recognition. Trust had been given once. It did not need repeating to remain true. On her porch, Eleanor kept the radio, the lantern, the gloves, tools for moments she could not predict. She no longer fed the woods. She cared for what care required and left the rest alone. The balance felt honest, if not simple. The knock that changed everything never came again. But its echo remained, not as fear, but as a steady knowledge. That sometimes the greatest gift a wild thing offers is not a life to keep, but a choice to make, and the courage to live with it. If this story stayed with you, even for a quiet moment, I'd love to hear from you. You don't need to write much. Just leave a 0 if you believe she did the right thing, or a 1 if you think you might have chosen differently. Your simple comment tells me you were here, and that this story mattered to someone. And if you'd like to continue walking with me through more true stories of trust, courage, and unexpected bonds, please consider subscribing to the channel. These stories aren't fast, they aren't loud, but they are real. And there are many more waiting to be told. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.
Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.